This is Defender Radio. Defender Radio is brought to you by the Association for the Protection of Fur-Bearing Animals.
It's the week of February 13, 2017, and this is Michael Howie welcoming you to episode 416 of Defender Radio. You'll have to forgive my voice in this introduction. The winter cold I thought I'd escape for the year has come for me with vengeance dripping from its claws. But, despite the desire to hide under a blanket and whine at my wife, which she said would make her my ex-wife, I've mustered the strength and closet's worth of pharmaceuticals to carry forward for you.
Oh, poor baby.
There is a war on wildlife in the United States, waged with federal dollars at the behest of large lobby groups. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but there's no hiding the nefarious truth about this one. The United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA, has an offshoot called the Wildlife Services Program. This division has, for decades, slaughtered wildlife to the tune of 500 animals per day across America. Despite the ongoing rise in scientific evidence pointing toward coexistence as a successful strategy to ending or preventing wildlife conflict, this agency continues in its Wild West style of management. But standing up for the animals are numerous nonprofits, including the WildEarth Guardians. The group recently updated and re-released their in-depth solution-oriented report, War on Wildlife, that looks at the Wildlife Services Program and accompanies a new action-focused website, endthewaronwildlife.org, to help American supporters take action against the killing. To discuss the report, the history of the USDA's Wildlife Services Program, and how we can all fight the war on wildlife, Defender Radio was joined by WildEarth Guardians Wildlife Coexistence Campaigner Dr. Michelle Lute and Carnivore Advocate Kelly Nokes.
We've got kind of a lot of different things I think we need to cover today, least of which is the updated report, War on Wildlife, regarding the USDA's Wildlife Services Program. We've got, a new political administration happening in the United States that's really sort of rattling a lot of people in the scientific and nonprofit communities. And we've got sort of the current state of science itself and sort of the new things that are coming up and pushing out old ideas. I thought, though, to start, if we look at the history of the Wildlife Services Program, there is a nice sort of relatively short write-up in the report, but if you could summarize maybe just sort of where this comes from, because I don't think we have anything in Canada quite like it. I don't think there's anything like it in the world, to be honest.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not familiar with a comparable program in anywhere else, but obviously there's lots of places that kind of have these myths and prejudices about carnivores, keeping them using outdated science and lethal technology to get rid of carnivores on public land. So that's not necessarily unique, but yeah, this program being under the U.S. Department of Agriculture is also sort of an anomaly because Wildlife Services is managing wildlife, so it really should be in the Department of the Interior. And that's, I think you'll see in the report, one of the recommendations we have for reform. But jump in at any point, Kelly, if you want to talk about any of the history of wildlife services. But, it's this old idea of animal damage control, and it's based on these myths and prejudices about carnivores being bad. So Wildlife Services claims that its goal is, quote unquote, to allow people and wildlife to coexist, but really nothing could be farther from the truth. The name is actually quite ironic, I think, because the only thing they really serve are ranching and agricultural interests. So they keep wedded to this lethal arsenal and this old science, even though the best available science keeps coming out, and we've been trying to remind them and make all of that science available. And they even have a research center where they do test new non-lethal methods, but they're not operating them on the ground. And they really just operate with this implicit goal that the only good coyote or wolf is a dead one. So it's really quite unfortunate that they've been so reluctant to change.
Well, and this isn't new either. They've been around. In your report right here, it says since the late 19th century, and that's maybe not the actual Wildlife Services. That's sort of its predecessor.
Sure. Yeah, it's changed names a few times, but they're still operating with the same archaic tools, like traps, snares, and poisons. Like, these things are indiscriminate, they're cruel, and there's way more effective tools to be using, and yet they refuse to use them in most instances.
Well, and if we look at that historical perspective, and I think, Kelly, you may be able to jump in on this part, is this, like, was there ever science that indicated that carnivores were a problem, or was it very simply a cultural issue that people sort of saw carnivores as a way to manage it?
Well, like it says in the report, I mean, the federal wildlife killing dates back to before there was even statutory authority for wildlife services or its predecessor to even exist. And a lot of that is based on the cultural norms of the time, as far as these were back in the days of frontier settlement, and we're coming into land and taking over by planting crops, and there's bears in the way, there's predators that are eating our cows, and so it all comes back to that cultural sense more so than I think the science-based sense, and that's what really, before, I mean, the program was in existence just in the most basic sense of the government was responsible for clearing the land for settlers to come out and to make it more amenable to develop the area and settle there. And then they actually got the statutory authority to do so under the Animal Damage Control Act back in 1931. And what's unfortunate is that act is still in place, very much in the same language. I mean, I even have the original authorizing principle in our report there, and you can see that from Wildlife Services website, very little has changed. They've always looked at wildlife as a problem, as opposed to a natural part of the ecosystem.
And I think it's very important, too, to point out the funding structure. And I believe, Michelle, you sort of started to allude to this. But we can see in the report, and again, it's the last available data, which is 2014, 2015. Their budget was in excess of 167 million or some figure that almost seems ridiculous.
Right. So from 2012 to 2014, they spent over $182 million is one of the stats that we put out. And that's solely federal funds. That's not even counting the funds that cooperators contribute. And that resulted in 4.9 million native animals being killed by all these various methods.
Yeah, and it's in that period, too, that amounts, the 4.9 million native animals, to 4,500 native animals killed every single day. And right. I don't know, I get stuck on the USDA every time I speak about it. I do not understand. In Canada, we've got some really, really bad policies, but it's pretty obvious what they're trying to do at the very least. Whether or not you agree with it or the science agrees with it, it doesn't matter. But in this case, what possible benefit is there in trying to sort of be in their shoes to killing this extraordinary volume of animals, particularly when we start talking about predators or slowly reproducing carnivores?
I mean, that's a great question. And that's the one that we all have. We're all scratching our heads on that because there's these outmoded ideas that you can simply just wipe out coyotes across a landscape and that's going to help you during calving season. But the new science is now showing, and it's not even that new, but increasingly every year we're getting more and more information that's showing coyotes will respond to that like rampant killing with compensatory breeding. So these gains that ranchers think they're seeing are really short term, and it disrupts age structure. It disrupts pack dynamics. So we've probably got younger individuals that are out and more likely to attack livestock because they're less experienced and they don't have the adults that are more experienced at identifying native prey. So it's really creating a lot of chaos on the landscape that's not serving anybody, not even agricultural interests. And we've got, again, lots more new science testing all these non-lethal methods. So it's a matter of, I think, habit to a certain extent and what people are comfortable with. And there's probably lots of folks that grew up with traps and aerial gunning, and to adapt and use new tools is tough for everybody, but it's well past due. It's time to use these new tools that would best serve everybody, protect livestock and wolves and other carnivores.
And Kelly, how do people come to use the USDA Wildlife Service? That's another part that's a little unusual, particularly from the Canadian standpoint, where it's all provincial or the equivalent would be state run. So how does, if I'm running a community and the farmers are saying, gosh darn it, these coyotes, what happens between then and USDA coming in and just killing?
Well, Wildlife Services is a cooperator-led program, and so basically they only respond to requests for assistance, whether that's from a private individual, a private rancher, or that's from a state entity like a state wildlife management authority. And so they only respond to requests for action. So you need to file a request with Wildlife Services for any sort of killing to occur, and then they also require that you sign a memorandum of agreement, which allows them to come onto your land or your property and to conduct the killing activities that they agree to. So it's very much a cooperator-led program. But that said, there's 4,500 animals killed daily by this program. And so you can just imagine the number of requests that they're getting for these services and how it's just become ranchers are having an issue. They're going to call up Wildlife Services and they're going to expect them to come solve the problem. And I say solve in quotation marks, as far as, are they really solving the problem, as Michelle alluded to? The science shows that they are not.
Well, and the other thing too in the U.S., which again is different, and I think is very, very important to point out relatively early on in any conversation like this, is the use of public grazing land. It's a very unique, I believe, idea compared to what we have here, where a lot of the ranchers may not own the property where their cattle goes out to graze, and that's my understanding, and I may be very wrong here, but that is often a site of conflict, is when these animals go off on their own with minimal supervision, and conflict occurs, however it may come out.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so could you sort of maybe explain how that process works too? Just sort of a very brief overview of it.
The process of grazing on public lands?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you, I think, summarized it quite well already. There's plenty of areas where ranchers can get permits to graze their cattle on public lands that are managed for multiple interests, including people who want to recreate on these lands. If they're Forest Service lands, sometimes they're being used for timber as well. So there's multiple interests involved in these lands, and ranchers can get permits that are federally subsidized. So they're essentially putting their cattle out for prices that they wouldn't necessarily be paying for land in other places. So, and that's a key part of our one of our asks for reform, is that, this is public land that belongs to everybody, all citizens of the United States. So it should be managed as such. And right now it's being managed for private agricultural interests. And we're hoping that this program can reform to at least recognize that there are people who want to safely recreate on these lands, and they have just as much of a legitimate interest as these ranchers do.
And something I find curious is the process of trying to talk to these individuals, whether they're landowners or districts or states who are running into conflict, whatever it may be. And I deal with this sometimes too when we talk about very local level conflicts prevention and mitigation, and say, we can provide you with educational materials. We'll do seminars. but a level of work has to be done on the ground by the people who live there. And that's often where things seem to break down, especially when, depending on the area, you have someone sitting there saying, I'll go out and kill all of these animals for you, or I'll remove them humanely, as they may say. So how do we, and this is a huge question that I'm going to insist on a very brief, concise answer to, because it's fun to be mean. How do we talk about this? So, I mean, we see wildlife services killing almost endlessly animals with unmeasurable impact on the ecosystem. And at the same time, we have this science that's showing us these coexistence methods work. How do we have that conversation? Particularly, I would think, in areas where, you know, the agricultural interests have become the culture.
That's a great question. I think the key will be to work with people on the ground to implement these new non-lethal tools. So, for instance, aerial gunning is quite an expensive endeavor, and it takes quite a bit of time. So, we're asking that people consider new, more effective tools that are not anywhere near as expensive as aerial gunning. They do require effort and time on the ground, and so there's a bit of a cultural shift that has to happen. But I think once we can make the case, when we can sit down and talk to folks and show them the science and the numbers on how this is effective and can work, I think when we can have those open conversations, then we can start to work together towards a better management of public lands and protecting livestock and our native carnivores.
And if I might just chime in to add to that, another key part of that is taking away this tool that is readily at the fingertips of ranchers using public lands. I mean, if we take away Wildlife Services' ability to use lethal control on our public lands, which is a reasonable request from our point of view, considering these public lands belong to all of us, if we can take away that tool, then they're going to be forced to consider these non-lethal actions and see that if they actually deploy them, this could be a win-win situation for us all. So I think taking away that tool from the toolbox is a key part of it as well. Absolutely.
And I think that's, you know, when you get into a position where killing isn't an option. And I see that a lot in our urban centers when we talk particularly about coyotes. I'm sure both of you have dealt with this too. And they say, well, we've got to get rid of these coyotes. And you say, there is no safe way to do that. Like whether you're talking downtown Hamilton or Toronto or, you know, right in the middle of Santa Fe or Chicago, you can't put out traps. You can't have guns. You can't have poison. And you have to find another way to do it. And that's where some of these really great programs develop. Why wouldn't the wildlife services embrace some of these things?
I don't have a good answer to that. I'm not in the minds of any of wildlife services other than just it's the status quo.
That, and just to add to that, I think there's a whole culture built up around their historic techniques. Many people working for wildlife services still think trapping is a sport that has historical notions and is an important facet of our history and a historical hunting technique. Whereas if you look at it now, I mean, from my point of view and from many members of the public point of view, it's a cruel technique to kill an animal. It's not a quick kill. It's not a fair chase kill. So there's this whole culture, I think, that we need to overcome within wildlife services and the employees of wildlife services itself, as far as getting past what is normal and what is acceptable in today's society.
And looking at this report, sort of overall, I've skimmed it, I've read it cover to cover, I've skimmed it again. It's a very well put together report that provides the history, the costs, some of the potential, fallout of how the USDA is currently running their wildlife services program. And it sets out very clear solutions as well, which we've discussed a few of them. And I think that's always a priority when we're talking about these changes, is having these, as you call them, recommendations for reform. And they're all reasonable as well. That's sort of the best part. What would you like the public to do with this? I mean, I know you've got a a campaign website, End the War on Wildlife, and that's one of the places where this lives. Is this the kind of document you expect all of the public to read all the way through? Or is it maybe more of a resource for those who are in a position to talk about it?
Yeah, I believe we see this report as, available and open to anybody who really wants to dig into the history and where we would like to see reform go for this program. As you mentioned, the new website that we have in thewaronwildlife.org, that's meant to be more broadly available to the public. And so one of the key points of intervention that we're planning next is to look at county contracts. So Kelly was talking about the various cooperators that reach out to wildlife services. They can be private individuals, but often there are county commissions that contract with wildlife services. And so one of the places that we're looking to intervene is to get these county contracts canceled. So we need the public to be reaching out to their commissioners and saying, hey, we don't support these contracts. We want coexistence, non-lethal mandates happening in our county to manage our public lands.
And the science certainly backs a move like that. Again, looking at the local or microscopic level, we see that when we use lethal control, as we said with coyotes, as sort of the ideal example. I was looking at a study just the other day. I think it's a few years old now, but it stated even when coyote populations were reduced by as much as 70%, within 2 years, the population had completely rebounded. And coyotes are not that easy to kill in large numbers. Mm-hmm. They are very smart. They're very adaptable. And as you said, we've also seen the reproductive rates increase. So is this maybe also a financial issue? Is this where the commission, the county can say, we've got these complaints, let's get USDA to come in and take care of it for us, versus let's enact, reforms or bylaws or what have you that will require change locally, that will require our costs to maybe be adapted to this. When the county says we want to bring in wildlife services, and is there a cost to the county, or does the federal funding cover that? Right.
So a lot of federal funding will cover it, but in most instances, the cooperator also provides a certain amount of money, and that varies substantially depending on the cooperator.
Okay, so it is unlikely then that they are looking at this purely as a financial sort of, if it costs more to do one than the other.
I mean, I'm sure that's a consideration, but it wouldn't be any different for non-lethal, because wildlife services could be helping them with that and still be providing federal funds to do so, which would be more in line with what would be an ethical use of taxpayer dollars.
Well, and that, just to chime into your first point, you made an excellent statement that says that killing these coyotes is not solving the problem. 2 years later, they're going to have to do this all over again. So if they actually use those funds to deploy non-lethal techniques and try to actually come up with a real solution to the problem, there's your economical argument right there. I mean, the studies show that within 2 years of killing all these coyotes, they're just going to come right back and rebound. So that's a huge part of the argument as well, I would say.
Yeah, and I was actually just talking with someone today about that and saying it's better to have a coyote that knows you're not a food source. So there are no attractants, and if you come too close, you're going to get hazed, than new coyotes coming in and exploring or maybe not learning those lessons.
Exactly.
We can, in some ways, train wildlife like that. It's pretty interesting. And I'd like to sort of move a little bit away from the report, and there's two things I really wanted to cover off that I think the two of you are kind of uniquely situated to speak about. One is the overarching North American model of wildlife conservation, which is very much what a lot of and I say our, I mean Canada and the United States, have our wildlife policies based upon. It says that we shouldn't commercialize it, that we have to use science, that we have to make sure there's an ongoing population, etc. But a lot of criticisms say that it's all human-centric or anthropocentric, mm-hmm. In that the entire thing is not about protecting wildlife, but ensuring continued use of wildlife mm-hmm. for people. is that maybe something that we need to be looking at as well? The understanding we have of the history of our interactions with wildlife. Because, I see the quote from Aldo Leopold on your report, and I think of the number of times I'll see trappers, whether they're, professional fur trappers or hobbyists, or sport hunters, who say, we pay for all of this, we manage all of this. It's because of hunters that wildlife conservation exists. But that's not really true. They played a part in it. So how do we reframe that discussion, which I kind of personally feel is a huge part of the culture around getting change made now?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think it's going to take restructuring how state wildlife management agencies are funded. The sportsman community has been involved, as you've mentioned, and right now, Pittman-Robertson Act means that the taxes around firearms and the purchase of bullets and all the sportsman-related equipment goes towards state agencies. So we need to expand that to include photography equipment and outdoor gear of all sorts, so that we can say there's all these folks who are contributing to conservation. It's not just hunters and trappers and fishermen. And those ideas have been thrown around, and there have been initiatives in a number of places to try and expand the use of Pittman-Robertson dollars, but they've been fought. There's been strong, powerful lobbies against broadening that funding structure. So that's something that needs to change, but is going to be quite a battle.
And I would just chime in that the reason that there's such opposition to that is because the hunters and the sportsmen don't want to give up the control that they have over the model currently. I mean, that's the huge part. I mean, it comes down to, as Michelle mentioned, reforming the structure of state agencies, wildlife management agencies, but also just importantly, restructuring wildlife, fish and wildlife game commissions as well. And these are the people that are actually the state agencies are supposed to be held accountable to, who are making these decisions. And most of them aren't even scientists. They're not even biologists. There are a lot of sportsmen's interests or a lot of development interests who have that seat at the table right now. Whereas conservationists and people who believe in the sense that, our government has a public trust responsibility, not just to our generation, but to future generations as well, to maintain and restore native ecosystems, including native carnivores, and to live and coexist with them for future generations. And so that's a huge part of it, is the sense that the sportsmen already have the upper hand on us with the seat at the table, and we're trying to battle our way in, which is a very key part of our campaign, I would say, most definitely.
Well, and that's certainly something that I personally focus on a lot, is maintaining that sort of scientific basis. While I am by no means a scientist, my background is journalism, it's the same principle, though, of being able to corroborate and prove what I'm saying. And I think that's something that WildEarth Guardians is doing an outstanding job on. And something that we certainly try and strive towards as well, is saying, we're not just saying don't do this. We're saying, here's why you shouldn't be doing it. Here's what happens when you do it. And here's the solution that we could try differently. But that kind of reasoning these days seems to be not so popular, which brings us along to the next happy point. Politics in the United States. I want to make a joke about putting up a wall or going further north, but I find it very difficult. As much as I laugh at the comedy, it's still astounding what's happening. And I'm not going to ask you directly about the Great Orange one, because I do recognize that you have to remain somewhat nonpartisan, but is there a fear? We had a prime minister who for years silenced scientists, and it was terrifying. Because we didn't know anymore. We weren't getting reports. We didn't know what populations were doing. We didn't know if new ideas were being tried. And it was a very frightening time to be in the business of wildlife advocacy. Is that sort of the culture maybe, or the climate that's starting to appear on the horizons there?
Well, I mean, there's definitely lots of regrouping and thinking about new strategies to move forward. I think within the scientific community, there was obviously a bunch of scrambling to protect climate change data. But in terms of our work with wildlife, I wouldn't say there's as much fear as this has been a wake-up call, a cause to rally around, and we're seeing a lot of cohesion within the environmental community to work together and make our voices heard and make sure that the science isn't silenced. So it's a challenge, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily we're not being driven by fear.
Well, and just to add to that, I would say that I'm an attorney for Guardians, and so a lot of my work focuses on the legal aspects, which the science directly plays into every case that we litigate. And I would say that what we're seeing now is how intertwined the politics is becoming into decisions that should be based clearly on the best available science. And so it is concerning how we're experiencing different political bills, legislative bills that are trying to override the science, like the Great Lakes wolf delisting bill that's going through the legislature, and bills like that. Or I work primarily on carnivores in the West, and grizzly bears are a big issue right now in the Greater Yellowstone delisting contests, or removing Endangered Species Act protections from Yellowstone grizzly bears. And we fear the similar thing that's going on with wolves to a degree, as far as the science says that these animals are not ready to remove their federal protections, yet politicians are taking that science into their own hands and twisting it to say, it doesn't matter. We want it this way, and this is where we're going to go. And so I would agree with the way Michelle answered that question, but I would also say that still very cautious, that we do need to make sure that we have those scientist voices that are being pushed forward, and that we from the nonprofit environmental community can play a role as far as getting some of that science into the hands of the public, whereas maybe our government officials, as sad as that is, cannot.
I would certainly say that getting the science and science education, to me, over the last couple of months, is becoming more of a priority, and I'm seeing it. I think some of the incredible things happening with some of your your federal agencies on social media. I wrote about what the National Park Service did, and how inspiring it is, and how in these times, speaking out with the truth, with fact, is perhaps our most powerful weapon to protect wildlife. So I'm very hopeful to see that, and to know there's organizations like yours and many others working for the animals in the United States. And you mentioned the Great Lakes wolf delisting. I read a bit about that, and I understand many people are calling it the War on Wolves Act. And I think there's also a secondary bill which more or less does the same thing for a different region. But you're also calling your campaign End the War on Wildlife. And one of my big things has always been sensationalism. That's actually how I got into wildlife advocacy from journalism, was that congruence of coyote sensationalism into advocating. But I have to ask, is this sensationalism? Is there really a war on wildlife or a war on wolves? Or is this maybe sort of some kind of a marketing spin? Where is the and I don't want to use the word truth, but it really is sort of the best term. Where is the truth in this concept of a war on wolves or a war on wildlife?
That's a great question, and I would say it's not sensationalized at all when you look at the tools that they're using. And they're literally using everything in a lethal arsenal to kill carnivores and completely wipe them out. The aerial gunning, poisons, traps, all of these things are just like barbaric tools with no holds barred. And when the aim is to wipe out an entire population of coyotes across the landscape, I don't know what else to call that other than war.
And I would also just add to that, aside from the physical tools and what's happening on the ground, is also the political warfare. I mean, they're using tools legislatively to try to wipe out these populations, not only just with the physical means of shooting and trapping, but also giving the people on the ground that authority to do so. So I would totally agree that it's a full-on war on our wildlife.
There is a lot of resistance right now through social media, through nonprofits, through advocacy. And I think the ultimate question, I mean, for folks in our positions, you know, we've got a lot of meetings. We're talking amongst ourselves a lot, as you said, establishing, you know, where we can maybe target some campaigns, where we should be using resources. But for our supporters, from the animal lovers up to the board members or voting members of organizations, what are the best steps they can be taking, particularly as it pertains to your endthewaronwildlife.org website and campaign, both for Americans and for Canadians and for our listeners worldwide? Where should they be focusing their time and effort to help this kind of advocacy move forward?
Well, I think one of the first key steps is to raise public awareness. So sharing this information with their friends and family and coworkers. Wildlife Services in particular is working on public lands, and people are and their dogs are encountering these traps and poisons. So we really need to get people aware that these dangers are out there. I think that's the first step to making sure that these tools can be taken away, because the vast majority of Americans and I'm sure Canadians, North Americans of all types, are not supportive of traps, poisons, and snares on their public lands. So they need to be aware that they're out there so that they can protect themselves first and foremost, and their companion animals, and then work to contact their representatives and say, hey, this needs to stop.
To learn more about Wild Earth Guardians, visit wildearthguardians.org. To read the report, War on Wildlife, or take action, visit endthewaronwildlife.org. That's the show for this week, folks. Hope you join us for the next one. And remember, we're now on Google Play, iTunes, Player FM, TuneIn, and YouTube, making it easier than ever for you to listen in and share with your friends. Until next time, this is Michael Howie for Defender Radio, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.